right, my friends, we have a ton of information to cover. So for those of you I have not had the pleasure of personally meeting yet, my name is Rachel Gilmore. I'm the Director of New and Vital Faith here at the Desert Southwest Conference. Feel free to blow up the chat with where you're watching from. Any questions you might have, you can put in the chat or in the Q&A area there on the bottom if you prefer. We'll tackle all those questions at the end of our time together because we have some phenomenal presenters here. We have a lot to cover. So we do have Ray here. Ray, say hi. So we all say, yay, Ray's in the house. Okay, so Ray graduated from Boston University with a BA in environmental science and MA in environmental policy and analysis. She is part of the Desert Spring Community Resource Center, which was started in partnership with Desert Spring UMC in Las Vegas, Nevada. As the director of it, she leads organizational development, builds programs, connects with partners across the community. In addition, she served on the Board of Ordained Ministry since 2016 and is the chair of the Scholarship and Grants Committee. During the last decade, she's worked in nonprofit and government management. She's most proud of her community involvement and leadership roles. She worked to form the Nevada Housing Coalition, a statewide advocacy nonprofit. She also led the formation of the citizen group, the Downtown Neighborhood Coalition, which is a collaboration that works on local issues with the city of Las Vegas. She serves as a strategy team leader with Nevadans for the Common Good, supporting leadership development, citizenship empowerment, long-term organizational sustainability. She also founded the Southern Nevada chapter of the Young Nonprofit Professionals Network. Phew, say that 5 times fast. So Ray is here. She's going to be presenting some of our information, but we're going to get started first with Bethany Taylor. So Bob is hopping on in a minute. So Bob Holliday, here's where I love all the gifts of our annual conference. So Ray is one of our laity here in the Desert Southwest in Nevada, loves and is super knowledgeable about grants. So she's one of our contacts from the North District for those living in Nevada or elsewhere, but specifically contextually in the Vegas area. And then Bob is the pastor at Trinity. He has had a vast experience writing grants in California, multi-million-dollar government grants. So he's another really valuable resource if you're in the Phoenix area, so in the Valley here in Arizona. So I wanted you to connect with and hear from both of them. Hopefully we're having some technical issues with Bob, but he can hop on the screen too, so you can put a name with a face, and he can share personally in a minute. Linda Lewis is also not going to be here live, but she is our grant writer in Nevada. So if you are watching from the North District, you want to write grants there, I want to tell you just a little bit about Linda, and then I'm going to introduce Bethany and hand everything off to her to take it away, teach us all things grant related. Okay, so Linda, who again is not here, but is an amazing resource in Nevada. She's the president of Progressive Policy and Practice, LLC. She has more than 30 years experience in community-based health and social services management, program evaluation, policy and fund development, holding local, state, and national positions. She's operated a woman-owned consulting business in Vegas for the past 26 years with a focus on grant writing services for nonprofit organizations throughout Clark County and in other states as well. She was married to Jack Lewis for 47 years until he passed in 2016. Prior to Nevada, she was the executive director of a nonprofit drug abuse treatment and prevention program in Tampa, Florida for 13 years, then worked for the state of Florida as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Alcohol and Drug Abuse. In 1990, she and Jack moved to DC. She worked in the executive office of the president as the Deputy Director for Treatment and Rehabilitation Services in the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And she's also a lifelong member at Desert Spring United Methodist Church. All right, then we have Bethany Taylor. She's the president of Good Works Grant Writing. Bethany, say hi. Yay, we're so glad you're here. For more than 20 years, she's worked as a fundraiser, including serving as a major gifts officer for Children's Hospital Los Angeles, director of development for the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University, ASU, woo, and chief development officer for Make-A-Wish Arizona. In 2011, she launched Good Works Grant Writing as a way to support a variety of nonprofits in their fundraising endeavors. To date, they've raised more than $45 million. She earned her master's in nonprofit studies from ASU, a Bachelor of Science in Communications from the University of Tennessee, and she is also a lifelong Methodist, attending Methodist churches throughout her life in multiple states, and most recently at Dayspring, and currently at Paradise Valley, where she's been for 11 to 12 years. So thank you so much. The last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to shut up and just run the slides. Goals and outcomes from our time together, my friends. We're going to start with 3 elements of a successful proposal and just kind of a background on the grant writing process. top 5 considerations for grants, do some Q&A, and talk to you about next steps. So with that being said, I'm done. I'm going to go dark. Bethany, take it away.
Okay. I'm going to try to cram a lot of information in a little bit of time. So I'm not going to read point by point my slides. And if you see me looking over here, it's because I have some notes on another screen. So just wanted to say that. So before we get into actually writing the proposal, I like to always kind of point out that there are factors beyond the actual writing of the proposal that are important in terms of getting grant funding, because a lot of people think as long as I write a beautiful proposal, I will get funded. And so I kind of shape this like our hierarchy of needs, and from the bottom, what's really required, and working our way up. So first, please, whatever you do, first take the time to read guidelines and make sure that you're eligible to apply. There are going to be a lot of foundations, sometimes different government grants and things like that, where they will specifically say they do not fund churches. So you're going to want to always check that list of who they will not fund. Sometimes what they'll do is they will fund faith-based organizations, but not for faith-based programs, but for more secular programs like food banks or preschools or things like that. So make sure you're eligible before spending a lot of time working on a grant submission. Funders also want to see a track record. So if you've been doing something for a while, like if you have a food bank or you've been doing food programs, maybe it wasn't a full food bank, but hey, for the last 3 years, we've been giving out some food boxes once a month here or whatnot. Anything that you've done previously that shows that you're capable, they're interested in seeing. Also, you want to make sure that what you're applying for meets kind of what the priority is of the funder. And I always tell people, try to create relationships with the funders. Cold, sending in a proposal cold is it's not ideal. So if you're able to reach out first to the funder, talk to them, get them interested and engaged in what you're applying for, fantastic. And then there's the it factor. I don't know, maybe some churches will kind of meet that it factor, but I kind of give this example. I have a client that they work with veterans with combat-related PTSD, and they provide them service dogs, which primarily are animals they rescue from the Humane Society and the animal control. And so everybody always wants to fund them. I feel like they get 100% of the grants we submit because they just kind of have that thing that funders are kind of interested in nowadays. So you can't make the it factor, but just know that if you have it, you'll get lots of funding. Okay, next slide. I'm not going to go into all the different types of grant funders, but I wanted to let you guys know that there are kind of lots of different ones, and I think this presentation is going to be available so you can access this. But with foundations and corporations, when they have kind of a formal foundation with a board, often those are going to be the organizations that aren't funding churches per se, but will fund secular programs offered by churches. The exception to that would be if the either initial funder was very involved in churches, or if the company supports churches, like that's what they do. I was just looking at a grant where the insurance company primarily provides insurance to churches, so they fund church-related things. Government does do some faith-based. So again, just look, family foundations is probably the primary one in this group that will fund churches, because family foundations are kind of just like for the families get to decide where they give. So you might have families that go to your church that do their tithing through their family foundation. I think that's all I need to say here. If we can click on. Okay, so I like to position grant writing, proposal writing as kind of, there's 3 things you need to accomplish kind of to convince the funders of to get the funding. And the first thing you want to really show is that there is a significant problem. If the funders do not believe that the problem you're setting up for them is urgent or important, it doesn't really matter how great of a program you have. They're not necessarily going to be interested. And so you have to make them believe, yes, there's a problem and it needs to be solved. So then the next step is that you have a viable solution to that problem. So you've set up that there's a problem and it needs to be solved. And now you're telling them, and here's what we intend to do to solve it. And so they want to see a thoughtful plan. If it's addressing a root cause of the problem, all the better. Some funders only want to fund things that are transformational as opposed to transactional. So like changing the problem as opposed to kind of like medicine where you're just helping through the problem. So the third thing is that you have the capability to complete the project. So they want to see that track record. They want to believe like, okay, there's a problem. They have a good plan. And I have no doubt that they are going to be able to implement this plan and successfully do what they're saying they're going to do. So now we'll dive into each of these areas a little bit more in depth. So the problem, one thing I want to say, and I hope I'm not stepping on Ray's toes for what she's going to talk about, but you want to, funders are going to be interested in community problems. So if you have some trees on the south side of your property that have died and you need to hire someone to come chop them down and you're looking for grant funding for that, it's probably not something that's going to be fundable through foundation grants. They want to know what the community need is, not your own personal, not the organization's need, but the community's need. And again, if you don't convince them of this, nothing else you write matters. They're going to put it aside and kind of just skim over probably the rest. So make sure that you're, well, we can go to the next slide and we have some more specifics. So one place you'll touch on the community need is in your needs statement. And this will talk about what the need is and why they should care, kind of connecting those dots. I was a grant reviewer one time. This is probably like 12 years ago. And the applicant was an association that worked with home healthcare workers. And I was kind of like, at the, organizational overview, I was just like, And I got to the need, and they started talking about baby boomers aging, the need for home healthcare workers, how there already aren't enough home healthcare workers. And now, not only are there going to be more people that need home health care, but all these baby boomers are also retiring, so there's going to be less home health care workers. By the time I finished reading their needs statement, I kind of didn't even care what the program was. I was like, oh, we got to fund this. Like, we have to help this. This is a big problem that's coming down the pipeline. So make sure that you're kind of connecting the dots for people when you're talking about the need. And so, yeah. So focus on the needs of those you're serving. Connect the problems and its causes. And we'll talk in a minute about a gap analysis that you can do. But the other thing with a needs statement is providing data from reliable or sources. So you can say, the US Census, as states that there are this many people living in poverty in this town, or I always like putting the sources in the material, like in the narrative. So if you just say there are 2,500 people living in poverty in Yuma, and I'm just making up numbers here, obviously, it's not as reputable. They don't have the confidence in it as if you say the U.S. Census the U.S. 2020 census showed that there were 2,500 people living in poverty, etc. So use that as much as you can. I'm trying to look at my notes here. And then let's go to the next slide where we talk about the gap analysis. My computer for some reason is blowing up with emails coming in. Okay, gap analysis. So what you want to do in your needs statement is you want to look at what is the desired future state that we want to accomplish, and what is the current state, and where is that gap, and you want your program to address that gap. So a successful needs statement, you would kind of outline this gap so that once you write about your program description, they're like, oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what you need. So you're setting up your program description, if that makes sense, to show that the program is filling in that need. So this is something you can kind of just do on your own, figuring out where you want to go, where you currently are, and what's that gap to solve the problem. Next statement. And then if anyone has questions, I don't know, Rachel, when you want to do questions, if you want to do it in between each section or how you want to do that, or at the end.
We'll do it at the end.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like I'm talking so much and so fast, so I need to calm down. Okay. So target population, this is another way to really define the need and the problem, is to give information about who's going to benefit from this program. So demographics are important. Descriptions of the problems they face. What is life like for them? Tell their stories. What are the barriers that they're coming up against to get to that desired future state? So use statistics. External statistics are great ones to use. For those of you living here in the Phoenix area, Maricopa Association of Government has a great association. Maricopa Associations of Government, I can't remember, MAG. They have a great tool that you can use to like zone in on particular neighborhoods. You can use internal statistics. You can talk about your wait list. You can talk about the demand in your area. You can give the story of someone that you've served and helped. All of those are different ways to make the case through your target population. Okay. Geographic areas served. Again, define your geographic area. Typically, you're going to have better success if you're applying to organizations that fund specific to your area. And so, define what that area is, localize your data as much as possible. The need in Yuma is going to be different than the need in Flagstaff, different than the need in Tucson or Paradise Valley. So give statistics as much as you can on that local level. And then remember that regional and national funders are not necessarily familiar with local attributes. So one thing I'm always making sure when someone on my staff or myself is writing a grant, or I'm writing a grant for a national funder, that we're not using the West Valley or the terms like that a local funder is going to know what the West Valley is and what that means. And even sometimes I was like, don't say Maricopa County's, alone. You might say Maricopa County, home of Phoenix, Arizona, the 5th largest city in the country. So don't assume that at national level, they're going to know how large your town is or any of that kind of stuff. You need to give them those more specifics. Okay. So once you've established that there's a need, there's a problem that needs to be solved, you want to show them that you have a viable solution to that problem. So they want to know what you're going to do with the funds, what impact you think your program will have, how your program differs from other people addressing the same program, or are you collaborating with others? And sometimes the answer is just, we're doing a similar program to someone else, but the demand is so great, they don't meet the demand alone, we don't meet the demand alone, we all work together to meet the demand, and that's fine too. And if you are solving root causes of problems, for sure make sure that you're emphasizing that. Okay, so next slide. Program description. So the program description is really the heart and soul of your application. And you want to show that you have a thoughtful, workable solution. So the more details that you can give, the more they realize you didn't just kind of throw this together and shoot it out in an application, that there's like a real plan in place. There are real people on the ground doing this work. So you're going to want to describe the activities, what you'll be doing with the funding, tie it to the need or the problem that you just addressed. I had a staff member one time who, in the need, they were talking about field trips, and in the need, they were talking about how transportation costs are really hard for schools to get kids out on field trips. But then the program did not address transportation costs. So it's like either the program needs to address transportation costs or there needs to be a different need, because you have to have that tie between it. So by the time they read the program description, they should in their head be like, oh, that totally meets that need, because you've laid that groundwork for them. Make sure, again, you're tying the program to the funder's goals and objectives. So for instance, we were just applying for a grant for a funder who's interested in literacy by third grade. And we were applying for a program that is basically music education. And my staff member who wrote the first draft, a lot of what she was talking about was the benefits of music education. And it talked about doing better in school, but it wasn't tied directly to literacy because we had never actually done that research. So I said, let's do some research and see if there's any studies that show music education for children improve their literacy. And lo and behold, there was that. We found research that showed that, because the part of your brain that you're working when you're reading music is also the part of the brain for reading words and whatnot. So you want to tie it back as much as you can to their particular interests, which they'll list in on their website or in their guidelines and things like that. What else do I have down here? Oh, it's good to describe the resources that are needed to complete the project. Sometimes funders will ask you specifically to list these things, other times they don't. But the more that your budget and your budget and your narrative, not only do they have to match, but the more that they show that you've kind of thought everything through, I think the better. Because lots of times funders might look and be like, they don't have anything in this budget about their facility costs, but this is a food bank, and that seems like that would be a major component, and why is that not in here, or whatnot. So you don't want the funders to have questions after they've read your program description, because the more questions they have, the more uncertain they are that they want to fund you, if that makes sense. So as much as you can, get as the very specific information in there. I know sometimes they have these short character counts, and what are you going to do? But all of these things are important. Timeline is also a great thing to provide if you're able to. Okay, next slide. Impact. So I shortened this down for from my normal presentation on this, but I will say lots of times they're asking for impact. They use different words. They mean things differently. Sometimes they ask for your outcomes, but they're actually asking you for outputs, and it gets really confusing. But just know that goals are kind of like the broad thing that you want to accomplish. They're overarching statements. They're not anything that you're going to actually measure. So if you're doing a preschool program and your goal is to, let's say, have more of your kids graduating from high school, to increase the graduation rates for South Phoenix youth, that's nothing you're going to measure in real time, because it's going to be 15 years before these kids are seniors in high school. But that's the goal. So outcomes are kind of what in the more immediate area you're going to change. So what benefits or changes are resulting from the program activities? So that can be behavior, knowledge, skills, attitude. And these are things that you can measure through evaluation. And sometimes these outcomes are short-term, medium-term, long-term. But it's what the outcomes are, the real impact of your program, if that makes sense. Objectives are what you're going to do. So this is often that list of activities of what you're going to undertake in order to achieve the outcomes. And then outputs are the results of those objectives. And these are generally the things that you measure in volume. So how many students are you serving? How many curriculum lessons are being developed? How many workshops are you offering? How many boxes of food or pounds of food are you distributing? So those are the outputs. But again, if you're writing a grant, read the question and look at the examples they give. They often give examples. And so sometimes they'll ask for outputs, or outcomes, but their examples will be outputs. And so it's one of my pet peeves is that there's not a universally accepted definitions for all of these things that all funders use, if that makes sense. But for outcomes and outputs, you really want to have SMART goals is what they call them. But so where you're specific, it's measurable. I mean, the big thing is measurable. It's attainable, realistic, and time specific. So a good outcome might be that 75% of the children will complete who complete the reading curriculum will have higher literacy rate by June 30th, 2024 or whatnot. I'm kind of making this up on the fly, but you want to have, specific measurement and let them know what the time frame is to achieve that. Okay, next slide. Okay, the third kind of argument that you need to make is that you have the credibility and the capability to do this program. So highlighting the strengths and qualifications of your organization. I work often, or I get calls often from small nonprofits that are just starting. And honestly, I often feel bad like taking their money because I know it's going to be very hard for them. And often I tell them, like, you're not ready to apply for grants because they don't have a track record yet. And I know that funders, for the most part, are not going to allocate their money somewhere where there's no track record. So it's really important to show that you can do it because they want to make sure they're spending their grant funds wisely. So one thing to note is sometimes they'll ask specific questions related to your qualifications. Other times they won't. And so you really need to kind of weave that information in through the questions available to you. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I kind of talked about this a little bit, but especially government funders for this kind of second bullet point here is they want to know that you can manage grant funding efficiently, that you can handle the reporting requirements. A lot of government grants are reimbursement grants, so they want to know that you'll apply for your reimbursements and get them in a timely manner, because a lot of government grant funding comes from the federal government and they give it to local governments to distribute. And any money they don't distribute ends up going back to the federal government. So they want to know you manage grants, you can meet their requirements for reporting and reimbursements and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so next slide. I think I covered all of that. So a couple areas where you can weave in your credibility and capability would be, one is your organizational history, which you'll give kind of a brief description of the beginnings of your organization, and then detail out some key milestones, particularly anything related to the program that you're applying for. So we have a food bank. We started it 10 years ago during the recession. The demand has not gone away, so we've continued it or whatnot. Any awards you've gotten, if you've gotten awards, I don't know if I don't think the district does awards, but any awards, any community-based awards, sometimes like Chamber of Commerce or places like that do awards. Any large grants you've gotten, that shows that other funders have viewed you as being credible and provided you funding. So that helps them kind of believe in your credibility and your ability to manage grants. Any important hires, accreditations, if you have a preschool and you're accredited, say who has accredited your preschool. If you're, I think first things first is quality first ratings. If you have a good quality first rating, mention that. And then any examples of growth. So expansions of your program, expansions of your geographic reach, talking about the number of employees or volunteers, all of these things kind of show your capability. Next slide. Accomplishments. These are just some examples, but longevity, like how long you've been in the community, serving the community, your position in the community, if you're the first, if you're the only, if you're the largest, numbers that you're serving annually, and sometimes in total. So some people say since we opened the food bank, we have served more than 10,000 individuals. You can say something along those lines. Again, honors or awards, financial endorsements. That's the concept of other people who have funded your program. And it can be like you might be applying for your food bank, but your preschool's gotten some significant grants. I mean, I think you can mention that because it's showing that you have managed large grants before. So you can do it even if it's in a different program here. Seals of approval, testimonials from clients. We use that a lot. If you don't have awards or these other things, if you can use quotes or case statements of kind of people that you've served and how you've helped. Put reviews in there. That's probably not, churches probably don't get reviews, but I have a lot of arts organizations that, they can go on their Facebook and just like pull some reviews off of there that are good. Test scores, graduation rates. If you're doing, if you do assessments with, let's say, your preschool kids on kindergarten readiness and they're good, include that. Currently 95% of the children that finish our preschool program score 80% or greater on XYZ assessment or whatnot. I don't know what those assessments are, but you would. So yeah, program growth, that's another thing. We started out offering preschool and we had one, 3-year-old classroom and one 4-year-old classroom. And now the program has grown to where we have 5 classrooms for each age or whatnot, things like that. That shows your ability. Financial considerations. So funders will often ask for your financial statements. They prefer audited statements. They also will ask often for your IRS Form 990. If you don't have any of these, well, normally, and I don't know for churches if they do Form 990s, now that I think about it. So I'm not going to speak on Form 990s. But financial, if you don't have an audit, you need to be able to at least provide financial statements. That's going to be your balance sheet, your profit and loss for the previous year. Your budgets, they'll ask for your organizational budget and your program budget often. And really, I think the most important thing about this is it shows if you have a grasp on what is actually needed for a successful program. So if you have a program budget and they feel like you're not allocating enough to the program. Like there's nothing in here for facilities, but they must have this warehouse or whatnot. That raises questions, and that makes them think that maybe you're not really fully on top of things. So I always say your program budget needs to match your program narrative. So for instance, I was just working with a client and they were saying their staff was going to be mobile, and they, for this program, so they were going to hire 5 staff members. They're all going to be mobile. So they were going to have laptops. They were going to have portable printers. They were going to have portable scanners. They're going to have all this stuff. Then we get to their budget. None of that equipment was in the budget. And so I said to them, like, listen, you're talking about this something that these staff members will be provided. It's not in the budget. Do you already have all this equipment on hand and so you don't need to purchase it? And if that's the case, let's put that in the narrative when we're talking about the equipment they're going to need. Or you need to get this equipment in the budget, because when the budget's not matching the narrative, that's an issue. So make sure your program budget matches and make sure that you have everything in there that's needed. And if something's not in there, you can say in the narrative, like, we don't have the facility costs in there because the church is covering that and we're not allocating any of those expenses to the budget. So just be upfront on that, and that's great. Okay. Evaluation. I am not going to go in depth into evaluation, even though I think I have a couple slides on it. And that's just there so you guys can review it later. But do know that evaluation is important. Funders will ask your evaluation plans. They want to know that the money they give you is making an impact. There are kind of 2 different types of evaluation. Outcomes evaluation, and that's measuring your program's effectiveness, the impact that you've had. Pretty much always they're going to want to see outcomes evaluations when they ask for your plan or what you're measuring. You can also include process evaluation. That's good. I think they like that, but process evaluation alone without outcomes evaluation is not going to look great. But process is, how can we offer the program better? Are we meeting the needs? So those are the different types of evaluations. Next slide. Oops, one back, please. Okay, so in your evaluation plan, you'll want to identify who's responsible for it, who's participating in it. Again, tie the evaluations to any outcomes or outputs that you list in your program narrative. You can use qualitative and quantitative. So measuring it or, asking open-ended questions on surveys to learn about the quality. And you'll want to detail when you're collecting the information, how you're collecting the information, who's collecting it, how you're using it. Okay. Next slide. Letters of support. Sometimes they'll ask for it, but other times they won't, but they may ask for optional attachments. And letters of support can help give you that credibility. So if you're partnering with St. Mary's Food Bank, like if your food bank partners with St. Mary's Food Bank, and St. Mary's Food Bank, who's well-known and well-respected, will write a letter of support, then that adds to your credibility, if that makes sense.
I think we had a few questions come in, but we can tackle those at the end. So Sherry, we've had lots of great questions. So Bethany here is one of our grant writers. She and Linda are both incredible. There is no cost to churches to write a grant, but I am only going to have them work on grants that are in excess of $10,000. So this webinar is really important, because if you're writing a grant for $2,000, $5,000, whatever, anything under 10, she's providing all the resources to give you your best chance of getting that funding. But Bethany just did her first grant for a church in Show Low, and they got $200,000 to update their preschool for preschool ministry. So we want to really save the resources because there's only a finite number of grants they can write each year for our conference. So we'll get to that process at the end. But just so you know, yes, there is help. No cost to the church if you're accepted, meeting our requirements. Okay. Now Ray is here to take us into top 5 considerations for grants as well.
I have been working outside of the church for a long time in service provision and in some advocacy. And now that I'm working in the church, I'm seeing some of the things and thinking about ways to make grants more incorporated into our ministries and our outreach programs. So I have just a couple of lessons and things to consider before going after grants that I thought would be particularly helpful in the church context. So this is a long list, but I'm going to dive into each one of these separately so we can just go into the next slide. The thing we want to make sure everyone knows is that grants are contracts. They are agreements that you have with your funder. That means that there are deliverables, there are specific commitments that you've made about how the money will be spent, and there are repercussions if you do not meet these. So it's best to have a full picture of your program activities, your financial management structure, and everything prior to even applying for funding in order to ensure that you're going to be able to manage that funding as responsible as you can. Funders, both private and public funders, can take their money back. And that is something that could be really difficult if you have spent their money and don't have other revenue or other money sources to pay those back. So you never really want to get in a situation like that. Usually right after you've been awarded, you get an announcement, an email that you will get the funding. You and your grantor will work on an actual legal document that says, this is what's going to happen and here's how it works, and all the reporting and everything that's due and on what schedule. So just don't forget that a grant is a contract and that those documents that follow up an award are going to have all the ways in which you need to be following the management of their funding. And I would suggest that everyone involved in a program at least sees those at the beginning of that program period in order to make sure that they know all of the components of grant funding. All right, next. The grantor and the grantee dynamics. There is a relationship between your church or your program and your funder that is really important. Bethany talked about how funders have priorities and that it's best to really establish a trust relationship with a funder if you can. There is definitely power inherent in all relationships that exchange money. And so open communication, early communication, if you stumble, if you have challenges meeting the requirements, the best thing that I do is communicate a little bit more often with funders to ensure that they understand what's going on. Another thing is that if you apply for public funding, especially local, like your city or your county community development funding, those and state money, a lot of times those are reviewed and awarded by citizen committees or by your local elected officials. You'll be surprised by how many people in your congregation may already know about those committees, may serve on those committees, or have good relationships with your public officials and your elected officials. So think about how you might talk to people about the work that you're doing, especially around the time that those grants are being reviewed and decisions around awarding is made. You want to be careful, especially as a church or as an independent nonprofit, to not get too close to the lobbying side of things and telling people how to do their job and make decisions. But it's perfectly acceptable to invite people to come and see your church, invite people to see your program, talk to them about the wonderful work that you're doing in your community. All right, next. Okay, Bethany mentioned this too, that some grants, especially government grants, are reimbursable. There's a couple of different ways that grantors are going to give you the money. Sometimes They will only accept invoices with receipts that show that you've spent the money in the way that's been approved, and you submit those to the funder, and then they will review them and pay you back. Here in Nevada, we have very few government entities, and one, like the county, is in charge of a lot of that funding. It takes months to get those reimbursements back in your bank account. So always consider how you're going to be paying your bills well into the future. I would really recommend 6 whole months of operating costs in your bank if you are going after reimbursable grants, because it could take a very long time to see that money come back. Other ways that funding can get into your bank account, sometimes a grantor will give you a portion of the money up front. Usually it's private funding that will give you half or a quarter, and then give you the rest based on additional milestones and deliverables. Be very careful with some of these grants, because they still may require that you provide to them a detailed account on how every single dollar and cent has been spent. There are some funders that are just going to give you all the money you asked for at the very beginning and not check back in, but that is very rare. So you want to make sure that you have your system set up in place in your church, maybe a designated account where your treasurer is making sure every single receipt that comes out of that account is continued to be updated and listed, or a separate management entity or software like a QuickBooks or something else where you can manage that money on your own. But just always know that there will be some components of tracking your costs, and you want to have some of that process figured out even before you apply. And it's very appropriate, I think, to ask in any sort of pre-submittal info session or any sort of Q&A session you might find on a specific grant, exactly how they provide the money so that you can be prepared to manage it best. Next slide. Count everything. And this goes well before you're applying for grants. Bethany talked a lot about how to show the need, show how your programs are meeting that need. And then you're evaluating, the success of your programs at the end. Something that I think is really great is counting really hard things and tangible things, like how many volunteers you have, how many total hours of volunteer service have you seen in your programs, how much money is being donated to your programs, is how much food you're passing out, how many clothes you're passing out. Decide on the way you're going to count those, and then be consistent as you deliver your programs. Definitely also consider counting how many phone calls you get, how many inquiries you get about the services that you offer. Show that your church is an established, trusted institution in your in your community, and that people come to you when they have need. We know that happens a lot. We know churches are one of the first places people come and ask for help, whether they're your member or not. So keep checking. I would suggest starting a way to keeping track of how many times people ask you for help, so that you can really establish to funders, especially government, that you are already a trusted partner in the community. But if you get awarded, there will be plenty of other directions from a grant as far as what you're supposed to be counting and how you count it. And please remember that those grant agreements are contracts, and if you don't give them all of the data that they've asked you for at the beginning, it could implicate your ability to renew a grant in the future, either the one you have or a different one with the same grantor. So just be careful. Next, realistic timelines. A lot of grant money is allocated for just 12 months of a program. You can think that 12 months is a long time, but if you're suggesting or proposing a new program, you have to think that it takes a little while to hire somebody, a little while to train somebody, a little while to develop your process. It might be 6 whole months before you start serving your community if you're looking at something new. That means that the number of people you will serve, that the meals you will serve, the food that you distribute, the amount of clothes you will give out will only really be counted in 6 months because it took you so long to start your program. So really consider how long it will take to start spending the money that you receive, or how long it will be before you start counting the things that you're doing. I think it's really important that we consider in our church environment of funding some of the things that we already have a track record on, and really putting together a program proposal that says we're already doing great work, and we know we can start spending money and getting the impact that we're looking for immediately. You don't want to get in a situation where you get held back around hiring. It's very difficult right now to find early education staff, social workers, mental health practitioners. And so definitely I would consider researching or finding someone in your congregation or connected to your congregation that might be willing to staff those programs prior to the beginning of the grant year. I also suggest that if you're interested in applying for funding for one of your ministries or your services, that you really look at ways that you can show and demonstrate financial management and programmatic impacts while still a ministry of your church. Many of the funders that I'm looking at right now for us at the Desert Spring Resource Center are looking for 2 years of financial or organizational history. We do have our own 501c3 at this time, but we've been able to use the church's management and oversight of the program as 2 years of history, and then we switch to our own organization. So it's definitely something that's feasible to talk through how you've already done your work and now that you're independent. But just consider that your church might be a little bit involved in some of the transition from one program into more of an external program if you have a partner, or looking to fund your programs through a separate nonprofit entity. That's it for me. We will open up to questions.
Yes. So Bethany, if you could hop on again, I'm going to stop sharing here. We've had some wonderful questions come in. So for either of you, if someone is just beginning this process, like maybe they've done food pantries or community dinners, but not really tracked it yet, so they don't really have that track record to demonstrate, is it best to go for smaller grants, or maybe partner with an existing nonprofit that has more of a track record, but you're I mean, what would you recommend?
Well, I mean, it's gonna vary for every situation, but that's where I think, like those letters of support that I was mentioning could really fit in. So if you're working, so let's say you've been doing food boxes, but you haven't tracked how many or whatnot. But if you have a nonprofit that has been referring people to you for their food boxes, they can say for the past 3 years, we've referred our clients to, Dayspring UMC to receive this or that. You can do that. You can do it that way to get that support. Or another thing you can do is, let's say you're Ray and you have experience working, or I don't remember all of Ray's experience, but let's say you worked at a food bank for 10 years and now you've been brought to this church and to start up their food bank program. Talk about your experience in food banks. One organization that I used to work with was Circle the City. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Circle the City, but it's hospice care for homeless individuals. So they get released from the hospital, and in the past, they just most often would go back on the streets. their wounds would not be cared for. They'd get sick again. They'd be in the emergency room. So Sister Adele, who is a sister, I don't know, obviously Catholic, but she was a doctor for many years at St. Joseph's. She started Circle the City. We were able to raise a lot of money, like both before I worked with them and then after, off of her track record, her reputation. So if you're bringing someone in who has experience, let's say with food banks, and even though it's new, you can use that track record, their previous work track record, to show that you kind of have that experience. So there are ways around it, but for sure, start tracking your outputs, because the more that you can share of your past success, the better. So even if you're not having to quote track that yet, it's good to do that.
And I would add too, small grants does not mean less complicated or less reporting. Unfortunately, foundations a lot of times, or corporate giving entities, will only give out $5,000 or $3,000, and there is sometimes a tremendous amount of questions with those applications and a ton of reporting with even a small amount of funding. So don't assume that a small grant is going to be easier work or less work than a large grant, because all funders have a different approach and how they make decisions and what they ask for and how they want to know where their money is going.
I will say, and that's true, and it's like one of my pet peeves sometimes, is grants not being right. It's called right sizing grants. So like if you're giving smaller grants, ask less questions, ask less in reporting, etc. But that's not always the case. But I will say, and I think Ray touched on this, is that government grants are going to be the ones that demand the most. They're going to almost always be the hardest proposals, almost always be the most demanding in terms of evaluation and all of that. I have a lot of clients that have been didn't do government grants pre-COVID. They wanted to start applying for government grants when, ARPA and CARES money was coming out, and now they're doing a lot of government grants, and they're having to do sometimes monthly reports, often quarterly reports. And with foundations, normally you just like have the one report. Sometimes you do an interim, like mid-year report. So government grants do tend, not always, but do tend to have more reporting requirements.
Yeah, very true. My husband's church got one from FEMA, and they've gotten about 400,000 to date, but it is intense reporting, and it's the reimbursable thing that you were mentioning, where they have to pay it out of pocket, submit, hope the form is correct. They have to have 3 bids for all the contractual work and all. Anyways, it's a lot. It's a lot. So, okay, clearly we're going to go past 12 o'clock here, but these questions are so good that Bethany and Ray have agreed to stay on and answer a few more. So if you guys have to go, it's all right. The recording, the slides will be sent to you. These are really important questions. So, here's a quick one, and I'll try to answer it super fast from my end, and then you guys offer insight. There's a database of organizations that provide grants. Will you be sharing that with us? So the Desert Southwest Conference, my office has subscribed to Grant Station that can help find them, but our grant form online also says, hey, I want to write a grant for this amount of money, but I don't know what grant to find, so that Bethany and Linda and others can scan and find the grants for us, because it can be really, really hard. You could spend days trying to locate the right grant on the web, right? But I know there's places at public libraries or other ways to find them. Do you guys have quick tips if people want to try to find their own grant?
So the database I use most often is called Foundation Directory Online, and it's part of what is now called Candid. And my company now subscribes, and we have a membership so I can access it at home. But before I did that, I know at least the Phoenix Public Libraries, you can go to, I think it was maybe only at Burton Bar that it was available, but I used to go down to Burton Bar and use their Foundation Directory Online. And the other thing, I always want to emphasize is like, talk to your congregation members, see who they know, see who they're willing to open doors for if they can at all. At your church council meeting, see, like, hey, do any of your companies have foundations that you work for? Do you know anyone who knows somebody? Because if you can get a door opened for you, that's always going to make it that much more likely to get funding.
Yeah. And I would also look, especially as you're doing research on that gap analysis and finding organizations that might serve a similar population or have certain similar activities, to really learn, the landscape of your community, and that includes the funders in your community. Really already looking at that, the entire picture of the service ecosystem. And then also, yes, the Clark County Library District does have a foundation office or a grant technical assistance, and I believe it's at the Clark County, the Flamingo branch. Yeah.
And quickly, sorry, for anyone in Arizona, 2 places that do kind of monthly emails that alert you to some like current requests for proposals are the Arizona Economic Recovery Center. You can get on their kind of email distribution list, and also Vitalist Foundation has started doing that. So, and Grant Station does it as well, but that's more national. So those 2 will do that if that's helpful, just to like get an email once a month from each that kind of lists a whole bunch to look through.
Great. And that other one was Vitalist, did you say?
Vitalist Foundation.
Got it. Awesome. Okay. Another question that's come in is about historic churches, right? They're on the National Registry. They need lots of repair work. You guys can jump in. I have only seen one grant in all my time here to help historic churches, and it's like matched giving. If you raise $250,000, we'll give you $250,000. It's really hard. It's hard to find funds to fix your structure unless your structure is being used to solve a community problem. Would you guys agree? I hate to be the bearer of bad news. But.
Yes. I mean, and I guess it also depends on why your church is historic. You know what I mean? Like, so if your church is historic because, during the civil rights movement, something happened, you know what I mean? Like, if there's historic beyond old, then you probably there will be some other historical preservation grants that you might be able to get outside of like something that's specific to churches. Does that make sense? So like if there's like history, like something that might end up in a history book that happened at your church, there might be additional funding available through other places, but otherwise it's hard.
Both Nevada and Arizona state government will have a historic preservation office that, has a probably very small staff, but that's what they would be happy to help kind of think about what resources are available. And a lot of times state government is just really easy to contact and have a conversation with.
That I'm trying to type all the answers in here. Okay, so we have a similar question where there is someone who is a United Methodist chaplain working at a not-for-profit hospital that is not affiliated with the UMC, and they're trying to start a new spiritual religious program in a healthcare setting. So should they target grants that fund healthcare programs or grants that fund religious spiritual programming?
Both.
Both?
I mean, again, it's finding the funder who has that niche. So ideally, you want to try to find a funder who's interested in spiritual programs at hospital settings. You know what I mean? But for sure, yes, healthcare, but probably not people who just like, we fund healthcare programs. That might be outside the scope. But if they're talking about wraparound services at hospitals or emotional support at hospitals, things like that, then that would be a good fit. If they're just like, we fund healthcare, then probably not. You want to have that fit.
Helpful. Awesome. Okay. And we're getting more information related to this particular historic church. It looks like that is partnering with an elementary school. So there's possibility, right? Like the church in Show Low got $200,000 because they're fixing up their building to enhance their preschool services for the community. So I will say that there have been questions coming in already, applications already for grant assistance. And some of them are like, well, we need another laptop for Zoom worship on Sundays. That is going to be really hard, if not impossible, to fund. Or we want ADA compliant restrooms. We all do. How many of us have historic churches where that is an issue? Again, it's hard to fund unless you are like one of our churches down south, you have an adults with that are differently abled daycare program at the church, that might justify updating the restroom. So really, it's all about community needs and service. So if you have more questions, throw them in the chat. I do see there are some of you on here that have administered grants before or written them. If you are interested in joining this team with Ray and Bob, who I'm going to try to bring Bob online too now, where you want to help others apply for grants and get the grants that they need. Let's see, promote to panelists. Bob, come join the party. I'm trying to build a team because I'm just one person, but I'm trying to help. So Bob is rejoining now as a panelist. He's another one of our pastors who's written a lot of grants. But you might be wondering about next steps. So I'm going to share screen one more time. Okay. If you're like, wow, I really want to write grants, but I don't even know my community needs, we have a Reaching New People in New Ways training in March in person at Dayspring. It'll be available online asynchronously via Zoom webinar shortly after that in April. But anyways, it literally tells you, how do I read Mission Insight? How do I get to know my community through different types of anthropological listening so that you can have really strategic insight as you're writing grant, both lived experience and then data driven as you apply for these things. Here's the link. And again, you'll be getting all these slides, but you could go to the Desert Southwest Conference. That's an application to apply for a grant writer so that, Bethany or Linda can jump in and start helping you. And then you can reach out to Ray or Bob with other questions as they arise. So I'm going to stop sharing this here. Bob, say hi. It's so good to see you here. Perfect.
Finally.
Yes.
I apologize for the technical difficulties. Yeah, I've been listening and I like a lot of what Bethany and Ray have been saying. And I like just to kind of segue and add a few extra things. and that is having in the past, for the past 15 or so years, I've been involved in lots of grants, $2, $3, $4 million in both outside the church and inside the church. And I think, one of the things that we need to do also is look at best practices in whatever proposals we have. And I'll give you an example. I've been part of a national movement. Many communities are familiar with the old DARE program. Well, DARE is not a best practice. And anytime that you write a grant that has a strategy that is not a best practice, it may be a good dog and pony show and it may be a good PR program, but if it doesn't have good, solid outcome measures and is recognized as a best practice, you're not going to get funded. The other areas that I think that Bethany and Ray have talked a lot about, I think is really important, is when you are looking for grants, you have to do lots of research. And the research is about not what a grant funder can do for you, but what you can do for the grant funder, because that's why they have the money. They want to make a difference in the community, and they want to find the best agencies that can help fulfill their purpose areas. And many times churches may not have a program to do those things. And so sometimes being creative in how we do the writing and so forth, and I'll give you an example. Well, when I was serving the church in Safford, we wrote a grant, an $80,000 grant to one of the community foundations, and they would not fund us because we were a church. And like it or not, we still deal a lot with separation of church and state. But more than that, funding sources do not want to be seen as endorsing a particular denomination or a particular church. And that's why one of the best practices is for the church to establish a separate 501c3 from the church. It could be a faith-based nonprofit. And in this situation in Safford, we developed a community nonprofit, submitted the same language, the same text, the same proposal, the same everything the following year through the nonprofit instead of through the church. We got funded for $95,000, piece of cake. Community collaboratives are another great practice because that kind of reinforces some of what Bethany and Ray were saying about financial accountability, particularly if you're new. Working with community collaboratives also helps you establish a track record, especially if you're new. I liked what we've been talking about managing the grants. If you haven't managed a grant before, it's okay to say in your grant that you're going to be working with a particular person to help you do that. Maybe you have a CPA or somebody in your church. CPAs make great church managers. And I know we're over, and I'm just going to, a couple things. Grant fundings don't like to supplant what's already going on. So you have to make sure that you're writing your grant to supplement, not supplant. I was writing some other notes down, the measurability of your outcome measures. And like I said, to look for a grant to do what you want to do is going to be really difficult. And by that, I mean, you know, if I had somebody come to me one time and ask me, said, Bob, you've written so many grants, and can you help us write a grant of how we can keep first-time visitors to join the church? Well, you know, the first question I ask is, what is so incredibly amazing about your church that a funding source would want to do that? You know, we're just not going to find that. And as Ray was saying earlier, and Rachel, finding grants that fund brick and mortar, they're not going to do that. Those are few and far between. But some sources, for example, Rachel and I are going to meet later. I have a file that's probably got over 600 funding sources right here in the state of Arizona to do things working in the community and with youth and so forth. I've been part of a $12 million grant through the Department of Labor, where we started the Metro Center in Tucson, which is ministries through mentoring, education, training, referral, and outreach. And when I was at St. James, we got $500,000 over a 3-year period of time to work with at-risk kids. These are all kids that were unchurched. I had 105 of those kids that all of a sudden became familiar with the church. And then I started hearing them talk about my pastor, my church. And those funds came from the U.S. Department of Labor. There's millions of dollars out there. In our book of discipline, restorative justice is a big part of our church doctrine. There's millions and millions of dollars through the Justice Department and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention on mentoring programs. And it just so happens that when we were working at the Metro Center, we became one of the only agencies in the state of Arizona accredited for this new mentoring approach in purposeful based mentoring. And so mentoring, food banks, food programs, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I can pretty much guarantee that if you work in a collaborative sense in a food program, they will fund 15% right off the purpose area.
I'm going to jump in super quick because we do have one church, Zion UMC, in the North District, who's doing remarkable work with urban farming and grant writing and everything. And just being mindful that we're like 15 minutes over. Obviously, you can see we have barely scratched the surface. Bob has so much wisdom to offer and insight, as does Bethany and Ray. Like we have a great powerhouse. And I saw Billy's name come up in the chat. Billy is such a gift and a blessing. Again, referencing what Bob mentioned with restorative justice stuff. You know, Billy and her role with outreach and mission and justice work is also available. She's phenomenal too. So anyways, what we want is for you to get curious, get to know your community, start figuring out what's next. You're going to get a link as soon as we're done here. It'll be emailed to you with the recording and everything. hopefully, should technology be on my side, which it has not been my best friend this morning. But it will ask what you liked about this webinar, what was not as helpful, and what you want to see next. And I know some initial ideas are a conversation with Bob if you want to get into mentorship or forming more collaborative approaches to writing grants. I'd love for Ray maybe to help do a webinar on 501c3s. Do I need a separate 501c3? What are their criteria? What are pros, cons, best practices approach for that? Because guys, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so that's really why we're trying to introduce you to this new approach of seeing how we fund ministry. I've said it once, I'll say it all the time. Tithes and offerings will never again be enough to fund a thriving full-time church and ministry. So we need external revenue streams. Grants are a wonderful way to do that. If the conditions are right, if the why is right, and our approach. But we have a team, you're not alone. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. You are all a gift. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email's in the chat here, rgilmore@dscumc.org, or my amazing admin. We're here for you. Thank you so much, Bethany from Good Works Grant Writing, and Ray, and Linda couldn't be present with us this morning, but again, she's a powerhouse in Nevada. And then Bob, thank you so much. So great team, guys. Thank you for joining us. Again, go to the website if you have questions about applying for a grant, and we'll take it from there.